pull up a population map of the United States. Look at it carefully. The east is lit up, dense, buzzing. Cities stacked against cities, millions of people crammed into a thin coastal strip. Now move your eyes west and watch it disappear. Not at the Rocky Mountains, not at any river you would recognize. The population just drops, suddenly, completely, like someone drew a line across the continent and said, "This far, and no further." That line is real. It does not appear on any official map. There are no signs marking it. No border crossing, no wall. You can literally step over it in a single stride. And yet it has shaped where 330 million Americans are allowed to live more than any law, any president, or any war in the country's history. I am Fish, and this is the geographic story of America's most important invisible line. Here is what makes this story different from anything you have heard before. This line was discovered in 1878. A single man stood in front of Congress and told them exactly what would happen if the country ignored it. He had maps, he had data, he had proof. Congress laughed him out of the room. And over the next 150 years, America proceeded to build an entire civilization on the wrong side of that line and is now running out of time to fix it. The line is called the 100th Meridian West. It is a line of longitude 100 degrees west of Greenwich, England. That runs arrows straight from the Canadian province of Manitoba, down through the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and deep into the Texas Panhandle. On a map, it looks arbitrary, just another invisible grid line on a globe, but cross it on foot, and the world changes completely. You see, east of the 100th meridian, the United States receives more than 20 inches of rainfall per year. That sounds modest, but 20 inches is the magic number. It is the threshold below which you simply cannot grow crops without artificial irrigation. It is the line between farming civilization and empty grassland. East of it, corn, soybeans, dense forest, rivers that run year-round, cities, people, life. West of it, the sky gets bigger, the grass gets shorter, the rivers get thinner, and the towns get further and further apart until they disappear entirely. This happens because of geography, not chance. The Rocky Mountains to the west act like a massive wall. They strip almost all moisture from Pacific storms before those storms can reach the interior. And Atlantic weather systems, which bring rain to the east, simply run out of energy before they make it this far west. The result is a band of semi-arid land, stretching hundreds of miles, that receives just enough rain to grow grass, but not enough to grow a civilization. And 80% of America's population lives on the east side. That is not a coincidence. That is geography enforcing its own rules. In 1869, a one-armed Civil War veteran named John Wesley Powell did something remarkable. He led the first expedition to navigate the entire Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, just him, 9 men, and 4 wooden boats surviving rapids that had never been mapped. But what Powell discovered on that journey was not just spectacular scenery. It was a brutal, geographic truth. The American West was dry, profoundly, structurally, permanently dry. Not in a bad year, not in a drought. Dry as its default setting. And the line where the dryness began was the 100th meridian. In 1878, Powell did something even more courageous than running the Grand Canyon. He walked into the United States Congress and told them the truth. In his landmark report on the lands of the arid region, he laid it out clearly. West of this line, normal American-style farming was impossible without irrigation. The land could not support the same density of settlement as the East. His solution was radical but intelligent. He proposed an entirely different system of land organization for the West. One built around water rights, watershed boundaries, and cooperative communities designed for the dry reality of the landscape. Smaller farms, shared water, realistic expectations. Congress did not just reject it, they mocked it. You see, this was the era of manifest destiny, the almost religious belief that Americans were divinely chosen to fill the continent from coast to coast. Admitting that the West had limits was not just inconvenient, it was heresy. Western politicians feared Powell's plan would slow settlement and shrink their power. Land speculators feared it would collapse their business model. And so, the man who had explored more of the American West than almost anyone alive was dismissed as a pessimist. They had no idea what was coming. With Powell silenced, the federal government doubled down on one of the most geographically reckless programs in American history. The Homestead Act of 1862 had already been sending settlers west, offering 160 free acres to anyone willing to farm the land. By the 1880s, a flood of migrants, many of them inexperienced, many of them desperately poor, were pushing past the 100th meridian onto land the geography never intended for them. And here is where the cruelest geographic trick in American history played out. The late 1800s happened to be an unusually wet decade on the Great Plains. Rainfall was above average for years running. Crops actually grew. And so, a belief took hold, a myth. Really, that became one of the most dangerous phrases ever spoken on American soil. Rain follows the plow. Settlers, politicians, and even some scientists convinced themselves that farming the land was actually changing the climate. That breaking the soil and planting crops somehow attracted moisture. That the West was becoming wetter because of human activity. Powell tried to warn them again. He wrote in 1890 that the wet years were a temporary anomaly, that the land's true nature would eventually reassert itself. Nobody listened. By the early 20th century, millions of acres of ancient prairie grass west of the 100th meridian had been plowed under. The deep-rooted native grasses that had held the soil together for centuries gone, replaced by wheat, corn, hope. The line had been erased on paper at least. The geography, however, had not forgotten. What happened next would prove Powell right in the most catastrophic way possible. And it would set the stage for an even bigger gamble one America is still running today and is about to lose. Suggested geographic bridge. The 100th meridian is essentially a barrier that most Americans have never heard of hiding in plain sight. And honestly, the most important things hiding in plain sight today are usually found in your data. That is where SP comes in. In 1931, the rains stopped. Not for a season, not for a year, for nearly a decade. The Great Plains, stripped of their native grass, with nothing to anchor the topsoil, began to die. The wind came, the same relentless wind that had always defined this landscape, and it found nothing to stop it. What followed was the Dust Bowl, walls of black dirt, some of them 2 miles high, rolling across the plains at 60 miles per hour. On April 14, 1935, a day that became known as Black Sunday, a single storm stripped an estimated 3 million tons of topsoil from the Great Plains in one afternoon. The dust reached Chicago. It reached Washington, D.C. It coated ships in the Atlantic Ocean. 2.5 million people fled the Dust Bowl states. Oklahoma alone lost 440,000 residents, more than 15% of its entire population in a single decade. John Wesley Powell had been dead for 30 years, but the land had just delivered his verdict, loudly, unmistakably. America had tried to erase the 100th meridian, and the 100th meridian had erased entire communities instead. So how did Western agriculture survive? The answer is one of the greatest geographic sleights of hand in human history. Beneath the Great Plains, sealed underground in a massive formation of sand and gravel, sits the Ogallala Aquifer. It is one of the largest freshwater reserves on the planet, stretching under 8 states, from South Dakota down to the Texas Panhandle, covering 174,000 square miles. This water is ancient. It was deposited primarily by glacial melt from the last ice age water that took millions of years to accumulate underground. Starting in the 1950s, farmers discovered they could pump it up, and suddenly, the 100th meridian did not matter anymore. You could grow thirsty crops in a desert if you just pulled the water up from below. The green circles of center pivot irrigation that now carpet the western plains from above, that is the Ogallala. That is ancient water being spent in real time. Here is the problem. Farmers have been withdrawing water from the Ogallala far faster than rain can ever replace it. Since pumping began at scale, water tables in parts of western Kansas and the Texas Panhandle have dropped by more than 150 feet. Some areas have seen declines exceeding a foot every single year. In Kansas, researchers estimate that roughly 30% of the aquifer is already effectively gone. In the Texas Panhandle, projections suggest that up to 70% of what remains could become unusable within 2 decades at current pumping rates. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. Once depleted, the Ogallala will take over 6,000 years to naturally refill. America did not solve the problem of the 100th meridian. It just borrowed against it with a loan it can never repay. And now, the final chapter of this story, one that Powell never lived to see, but somehow predicted anyway. The 100th meridian is shifting. 2 landmark studies confirmed what many climate scientists had feared. Due to rising global temperatures and changing atmospheric patterns, the aridity line that Powell identified in 1878 has already moved approximately 140 miles to the east. It now sits closer to the 98th meridian, cutting through territory that was once considered reliably wet. That means the invisible line that was once west of Dodge City, Kansas, is now approaching Oklahoma City. The geography that made the Midwest America's breadbasket is slowly, quietly transforming into something closer to the arid plains it borders. And as the line moves east, the Ogallala depletes below, the rains decrease above, and the populations of the Great Plains, already in decades-long decline, continue to shrink. Counties across western Kansas, the Nebraska Panhandle, and the Oklahoma Panhandle are losing people year after year. The small towns are emptying. The schools are closing. The geography is reclaiming what it was always owed. In 1878, one man stood in front of the most powerful legislative body in the world and told them the truth about their own continent. He showed them a line they could not see and warned them what it would cost to ignore it. They ignored it anyway, and America spent the next 150 years in a slow-motion argument with its own geography, building cities in deserts, farming land that could not sustain farming, pumping ancient water that can never be replaced, and calling it progress. The 100th meridian did not move because of human failure. It is moving because of human success. Success at burning the fuels that are warming the planet and pushing that line further east than Powell ever imagined it could go. The invisible line that split America's population in half is still there. It is just getting harder to ignore. If you enjoyed this, you will want to check out this video on why so few Americans live along the Gulf Coast, because the geography there is fighting back in a very similar way. Thanks for watching. The 100th meridian is moving east, but it is not the only invisible geographic boundary reshaping America right now. The next one, it runs right through your city.